I watched a conversation between Nick Eppley and Eugene Solis. Their conversation was mostly about white-collar crime. During the course of this conversation, Solis had actually both Eppley and Solis actually brought up how they actually met each other, which actually dates back to when both of them were in college. Um, Later on, Solis said um, that when he was working late and watching Espinor, Solis was watching cases and came up with questions. He basically thought of a bunch of questions that would relate to crime. From the conversation that both Epley and Solis ended up having, and they said that they think of crime from a victim's perspective, although Solis thought it would be better to think of the perspective of the persecutor's perspective. He brought this up because typically when crimes happen, especially when they get filed by people in the by the law force and by the police, he's typically typically the victim would fill out their information about it. That means they would find out what they discovered, and why it would be important. Taken from the perpetrator's perspective is a lot different, as it means that it would mean that you would have to catch the person who was responsible for doing the act in the first place and basically ask them what exactly was going through their mind. Uh, by saying this a lot, by saying this, um, both Epley and Solis kind of pointed out a lot of key tips. They said that people have no act while they're doing their crimes, which basically means that um, some people would just do acts for the fun of it, or they would just do crimes without having some real logical or reasonable explanation behind it. Uh, let's see. Yes. During the conversation, Solis brought out that a moral shift in white thinks that there's a moral shift in white-collar crime as there are different regulations. He kind of brought this up as basically from a case that he saw himself. He brought up Gary Becker, which is that was a rational act by someone who does the crime. Solis explained that there was at least two ways used to get people to behave for when it comes to doing a crime. The first one is they don't do a calculation, or two, they do the calculations but expectations are low. This basically means that the perpetrator or the person who is committing the crime doesn't really do a calculation to see how exactly their plan will go through. And as for people who actually do their crime, they have to realize that expectations are low because they can't really 100% think that they're going to succeed with getting away with what they're doing. Another case that Solis also brought up was on Scott London. And he was a man who was making $900,000 a year for his company. However, he did expect some sort of problems with his marriage and family. And basically, he ended up giving info to an old friend and took money to get a watch and concert tickets. It's because of this London eventually ended up having to face a year in prison. Despite that, however, Solis actually said that London is still the CEO of the company that he's still with. This actually kind of shows that when someone actually does a misleading deed, they just admit to it and they clean up their act. I'd have to say a example of this. I would have to say a little bit would be of Jordan Belfort, who worked for Wall Street but ended up causing a lot of fraud and money problems and ended up having to spend some time in jail. Since he had been released, he actually became a motivational speaker about how to be safe with the market, as he doesn't actually want people to fall victim to any of these acts that he ended up encountering. During the conversation, Solis also brought up that people don't proceed about their crimes since they don't see possible outcomes. So this basically means that the perpetrator or the person who commits the crime doesn't really think about that much because they don't really see an outcome where they can succeed with it. I'd have to say this as true because when you are doing a crime, you always have to think about the possibility of knowing that you can't really succeed with your goal because you eventually would get found out by a friend of yours or eventually the police. Um, basically, um, you shouldn't really feel. They also brought up that you shouldn't feel bad about an actor when they're talking when you are doing something like over the phone. Like when you're doing over the phone and they don't see you face to face, you don't really. You basically get to say what you want. Basically, people would have to take your trust. But basically, if you are doing it in person, it would be a whole lot different. An example during the conversation was that of Garfunkel, which was where he went to a bank to try and fill out some information. However, Garfunkel kind of realized he didn't have any vital information to fill out, and even though he did this on the phone, he couldn't do this in person because he knew he would be causing trouble. Um, Also, during the conversation, there was the huge concept of insider trading. Um, basically, during the conversation, we were told that the victims of insider trading are the people who try to help with insider trading, which, of course, is true because people who commit these kind of acts are willing to still do it again and possibly not learn from their mistakes unless they get put into prison. Um, During the conversation, Erna wanted to do creative ways to settle debts, which to them they thought they were doing the right thing. This basically meant that he was trying to settle some problems that he had, and to him he thought it was the right thing, but to other people it wasn't. This meant that Baran was basically committing a crime in the process since he wasn't really following proper ethics. Uh, Basically, both of them end up saying that we all do things wrong, but we all learn a lesson from it. I'd have to say that this is 100% true because as people ourselves, we know that sometimes what we do, sometimes we always have to know what we're doing. We also think the possibility if it's both good or it's a mix between good and wrong, or if it's just all wrong. We know that that's very risky as who we but at the same time, we do this because we need to at least be as much honest as possible when it comes to figuring out solutions. He also, another huge case Solis brought up was that basically, when we're in a position of, like a CEO or a CFO, we should always be careful with what we're doing, with how we're doing a company. He brought up that, like a CFO, at one time said they were joking about hurting rates, which even though it was just a joke, the CFO was actually doing interest rates really bad. This kind of shows that you can't really joke about something you're actually committing because this can kind of hurt your conscience, but not to mention this can also make people concerned that that's something you're actually doing. Basically, from watching the conversation, it made me realize that part of doing, part of understanding how crime works in a business setting is that you'd have to be careful exactly what you would either invest in or what you would decide to do is the right thing. It is kind of understandable to see why companies take such huge risks to make sure that they can have a future, but at the same time, it's also reasonable to know that you need to do the right thing, otherwise, it will hurt you long term, both for yourself and for your company.